Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel. Thanks very much for being here. Hope we are gonna, so we're just gonna explore with our fine panel of seasoned market observers exactly how the carbon market is doing. On one hand, things are going pretty well. California is on track to meet its emissions target of 1990 levels by 2020. And it's also generated, I think, more than $3 billion of revenue since it started trading in 2012. And it's got one trading partner, Québec, and it's on track to have another one next year, Ontario. On the other hand, auctions haven't been selling out for the past year. So that's partly due to oversupply of allowances, but that's also partly due to some nagging legal uncertainty. It just won a court decision earlier this month, so that's ruling that the auctions are in fact legal, but that might apply only through 2020. And then the decision's also being appealed to the state Supreme Court. And then most significantly, there are several legislative factions that are determined to see some kind of changes post-2020. And in fact, there's a bill that's moving right now. It just got amended yesterday that would likely significantly affect the market. So we'll discuss that. We'll discuss the court decision. We'll discuss market dynamics in general. Just anecdotally, at the most recent auction in February, State Senate President Kevin De Leon, who's speaking later today, sent out a press release accidentally a day before the market results were supposed to be announced, and he called the results anemic. And in fact, let's see. Can I do it?
Yeah.
Oh. So,
there.
Yeah.
So it's not on.
Oh, it's not showing up on the screen though, is it? All right, anyway, so, okay.
Oh, okay.
But it's the graph, so go back to the article.
Okay. Is that right?
Next. There.
Yeah, so he called it anemic, and prices in fact fell about 10 cents. So it's a sensitive market, it's vulnerable. And I'm wondering kind of just how much kind of abuse it can take before it stops producing the kind of results that people want to see. And we'll also talk about what kind of results people do want to see about the market. Like, what kind of market do we actually want? Do we want one that sells out every time? Do we want high prices? Do we want just kind of stability and steady revenues? What do we want? So we'll talk about how things are looking, what the role of the carbon market should be, and then we'll also hopefully leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. So our panel of esteemed market participants, they've all been around for a really long time. They're all kind of seasoned. So it should be candid and reasonably informative. So first we have Peter Henderson over here, who is the bureau chief, the San Francisco bureau chief for Reuters, and he's also the deputy West Coast bureau chief for Reuters. So he's been covering a lot of things. He covers autonomous cars, among other topics, but he's also been covering the carbon market for a while, and other California environment and energy issues, including the Trump administration's clash with California over its its mileage standards. So he'll be able to talk about that and kind of the national political picture. Then we have John Flederbach, Bill Flederbach. Oh yeah. Bill Flederbach, who is the founder and president and CEO of Climeco Corporation, which develops offset projects primarily for the compliance and voluntary markets. And he also advises businesses on their emissions strategies. So Climeco's projects are mostly outside California, and they're either projects to reduce methane from dairies or also ones that destroy ozone-depleting substances. So those are two of the protocols that are eligible to receive offsets under California's cap and trade program. So he'll be able to talk about how he sees the market evolving. He's worked in California and Canada, and so he can also talk a lot about Ontario and the upcoming linkage, what he sees from that. And he's actually seeing an increase in demand for voluntary offsets under Trump, which is fascinating. So hopefully he'll be able to talk about what kind of effect Trump is having on the markets. Then we have John Melby, who is on the board of directors of CBL Markets, which is an exchange that offers voluntary and compliance carbon trades. And he's also an independent consultant who advises emitters, government agencies, and financial institutions. And before that, he worked for Green Exchange, which also provided contracts for greenhouse gases, but also nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide. So he's been around the energy credits kind of markets for a really long time, and he was also president and CEO of APX, which specialized in renewable energy credits. So he's an expert in secondary markets and what they need and whether we need them, so that kind of interplay. And then we have Nico Van Alstyne, who is based here in San Francisco with the law firm Shepard, Mullen, Richter, and Hampton, and he represents emitters and also the International Emissions Trading Association in court cases dealing with the California auctions and the offsets program, and also he represents those companies in front of the Air Resources Board on cap and trade, the low carbon fuel standard, and other various aspects of AB 32. And he also handles emissions trading contracts and offset project agreements. So that's our panel, and yeah, let's get started. I was thinking we would start first when I was putting this together with the appeals court decision, but then amendments happened to AB 378. Which seems to be the most kind of salient. Like maybe we should just start with the news. So I don't know if you guys have all seen the amendments to that bill, but basically there's a couple bills right now that would authorize cap and trade to continue after 2020, and this is one of them, and there's two. And so this one was amended pretty much yesterday, and the bill from the chair of the Assembly Resources Committee, Cristina Garcia, is having a hearing on Monday. So it's still a pretty short bill, but it looks like it would cap individual facilities' emissions at their average annual levels from 2014 to 2016, and then also say that they can't get free allowances or even trade, I think, if they're in violation of criteria air pollutant rules. So it's kind of an effort to link conventional air pollutants with greenhouse gas emissions, which has been a core tenet of the environmental justice community. So it's still early for the bill, and I'm sure it'll be amended. I don't want to be overly deterministic or anything, but how would this kind of bill affect the market, and what would you guys like to actually see from the legislature?
Well, I'll jump in. I think it's way too early to talk about the impact of these bills on the market just because they are so early in the process. In addition to AB 378, there's AB 151. Both of them are being heard on Monday at a hearing. My prediction is that both will get passed up by the committee and continue to move forward. There are no other pending bills right now in the legislature, but that does not prevent the introduction. Well, not the introduction of a new numbered bill, but by gutting and amending an existing bill, you could put in a new vehicle for some other kind of bill to move forward in the legislature. So it's very early. We just heard the governor here a bit earlier this morning saying that he was going to be, he's all in for the next few weeks to work on cap and trade reauthorization. They do have a budget trailer bill that would effectively reauthorize and extend cap and trade through 2030. It's a one-sentence bill. It's attached to the budget trailer bill. I don't think that's going to be sufficient to get through this legislature. They have a lot of other interests, as reflected by AB 151 and 378. But clearly, the conversation has started and is moving forward in the legislature. And it's way too early to start to predict which of these bills is going to be the bill that will move forward. I think there's a lot more yet to happen in the legislature. So I don't see the market having much reaction to these bills, even should they both pass out of committee on Monday, which I expect they will.
You know, I thought it was interesting that the governor was also saying that you should have, he believed in cap and trade, but that there could be regulation going along with it, which really was a summation of the changes that were made to 378, that you've got some command and control in there. So I don't know how much, if any, negotiation the governor had in that bill, but at least he seems to buy into cap and trade. There's room for more than just straight extension of cap and trade as we have it now.
Yeah, I read it yesterday, and probably one of the best things about 378 is its brevity. It was a quick read, but when I opened the paper yesterday in the Bay Area, there's an article, and the first thing it says is climate change is making air dirtier. So there's a branding that's happening now that it's a cause and effect, right? Climate change is associated with ozone. And this is pervasive in the communication right now. And I think what's concerning to me, before I was involved in cap and trade programs, I spent a 16-year career in non-attainment, new source review, and prevention of significant deterioration, and all the rules that govern criteria pollutants, that govern areas that are in extreme non-attainment for ozone, that govern NOx emissions, that govern PM 2.5 emissions. So I've got some concerns that we're trying to link two very distinctly different programs. Under California EPA, there are programs that address these pollutants. If we're concerned about this picture with the traffic, do what other cities are doing now, which is creating emission reduction credits under the Clean Air Act for mobile sources. Look at incentivizing behavior to reduce criteria pollutants. And I'm concerned about the linkage with cap and trade programs. And some of what you had mentioned, Robin, with respect to no annual GHG emissions over the average of the 14 to 16, it's distinct. It says you cannot increase, and there are rules under the Clean Air Act that Nico is very familiar with as well, under the prevention of significant deterioration tailoring rule. It is specifically meant for increases of greenhouse gases and going through a BACT assessment, looking at BACT for greenhouse gases. All of the things that I think we're concerned about here in California are really addressed in other programs. So that's concerning. The thing that concerns me as an offset provider is when it says that if you're not in compliance, you're not going to get free allowances. How many of us in the room have dealt with, are you in material non-compliance or compliance, and have a potential whole year of offsets in jeopardy as a result of one day that had nothing to do with the baseline? So this risk is really significant. So all of a sudden, if I'm a regulated entity, I'm being told that if I have a non-compliance under a criteria pollutant, I'm not going to get my free allowances. To me, it's absurd. And then I think the other one that's interesting is, there's a discussion in the draft that if you're subject to cap and trade mechanism, so if you're over 25,000 tons a year of CO2 equivalent, they have the opportunity to look at air pollution control standards for criteria pollutants. So these are sectors that may not have been triggered under non-attainment NSR, that may not have gone through a LAIR assessment or lowest achievable emission rate assessment. Now all of a sudden we're giving the authority, simply because your emissions of GHGs are over 25,000 tons, to have new air pollution control standards for sources that should not have been governed under the criteria pollutant rules. So I think there's a lot of concerns in what I read. But the good thing is it was about 8 pages. So I'm concerned about the 8 pages.
I would add, though, I think it tees up the conversation.
Yep.
And clearly there's a strong environmental justice community in California, and there has been for a very long time. But I think they're perhaps even more in the forefront right now than they have been in the past. And that amendment is largely about environmental justice. On the positive side, from a market perspective, this discussion about extending the program, I do think markets react to that a little bit differently, because I think markets are looking to say, is there going to be a program here? Should I invest in the future? And that's part of the reason the auctions have gone off, not fully subscribed, is that what happens and go forward. And teeing up that discussion and having that discussion, my view is that there's a lot that's going to change between now and whatever the final bill is. And people are putting kind of stakes in the ground and starting that conversation.
It is important to note very quickly that both bills expressly reauthorize cap and trade through 2030. So at the beginning of the legislature session, and certainly back in December of last year, it was not at all clear that cap and trade was going to be the consensus choice in the legislature. There was talk of carbon tax. There was talk of pure command and control as a way to achieve the SB 32 emission reduction goals. There is a consensus now in the legislature that cap and trade is the vehicle through 2030. It's just a question of what gets added on.
Mm-hmm. That kind of goes to the overall maybe we can talk about how the legislative kind of negotiations intersect with the court decision. Because, and this is something that I know Nico can talk about, but the court decision that came out, I think it was April 7th, found that cap and trade, the auctions, are not an illegal tax under Prop 13. And also that they don't violate AB 32. And so the market kind of breathed a sigh of relief at that time. But I think it's still, and I guess it's kind of it affects the market when you decide, when you're talking about something before 2020, right? The market isn't responding to these legislative negotiations as much because it's after 2020, right?
Correct.
Okay, so I guess the question about the court case is whether Prop 26 could be activated after 2020.
It could be. Let's you're kind of getting ahead of us. Let's do a quick step back, if you don't mind, to talk about the case. It's a very important decision that came out April 6th, actually, and the important part of it is that it upheld the auctions as not being an unconstitutional or illegal tax under Proposition 13. It has the potential to be a landmark case. It's certainly a precedential case if it stands. It's a very important decision. The immediate impact on the market was that the prices did go up. So I mean, it dispelled the immediate cloud that has hung over the market for about a year, since early last year with the SCOTUS stay of the Clean Power Plan, followed by the request for additional briefing in this case last year. So that's what affected the market primarily, I think, during the last year. Those concerns, those legal clouds, have for the time being been lifted. And I think we can safely say that the auctions program and the cap and trade is secure through 2020. Because it will take, I mean, as soon as the California Supreme Court, assuming it does grant the petition to review, which is discretionary, but assuming it does, and it likely will, we won't have a decision until mid-2018 at the earliest, probably 2019. So for all intents and purposes, we're good through the current life of the program. So then the question is, it moves then to the legislature. But let's talk about this decision for a moment, because I really think that it's important not only for that impact upon the existing program through 2020, but this case provides the potential to provide a legal basis and foundation for emissions trading, not just in California, but more broadly. It really is a bold and novel decision. In rejecting the auctions as a tax, it found that they were voluntary, not compulsory, and that you got something in return. Your typical tax, you pay the tax, you have to pay a tax, you have no choice about it, and your benefit in return is indirect. The government proceeds. Here, you are getting something in return, and that's the real distinction, what makes this case different from others, this decision different from others. The court found that you got the right to pollute. That's not new. The right to pollute is something the government can regulate. But in holding that the allowance itself it constitutes property as between individuals, is new. And that is profoundly important because it provides the foundation for emissions trading for markets. It is a compliance instrument as between the holder and the government. And in that sense, it is not property. It is a compliance instrument. It's the way that you demonstrate that you have complied with the greenhouse gas reduction requirements. But as between individual holders of these instruments, they constitute property. That actually is novel. That has not been done by a court before. The court was bold in shaking off the restrictions of the Sinclair paint precedent, which previously governed all decisions under Prop 13. It had the boldness to recognize that these things are not either a fee or a tax. They're something new. And what are they? They're a new form of a thing that has a dual nature. It's not property as between you and the government. They are property as between private holders and can be traded. We'll see if that holds up. If it does hold up, it really could provide, again, a legal foundation, which surprisingly, because emissions trading has been around for a while, right? But there's not been that legal recognition in a court case to date. So this case has a potential to be very, very important, again, if it stands.
Do you need to get the state Supreme Court to back it for it to really have much effect, since it's 2-1?
It certainly would help. It's a 2-1 decision, and no question about it, there is a strong dissent, and the Pacific Legal Foundation has already made clear that they will petition for review, and I think there's a very good chance that the court will take it.
And if you're vote counting 7 members of the court, 3 are Brown, 2 are Schwarzenegger, the father of AB 32. Well, not exactly, but is it as simple as that? 5 folks who you're likely to get it?
No, it's too early. This court is fairly new in makeup. No question about it, just based on what you just said. I think ARB is probably feeling a little more optimistic than it might have 5 years ago. But it's too early to predict what the court would do.
Robin, what might be helpful is to go to, talking about the market reaction to this, to the ruling, which is really unprecedented. It was fantastic. I think in general, if we were reading the tea leaves, there was optimism amongst the market prior to the release. But we're always cautious of reading the tea leaves or drinking from the Kool-Aid. So I think we always were a little concerned about this. But if you wanted to go, now it's not up on the screen here, I'm noticing, but if you want to go to the other graph, which shows where the auctions were prior to this release.
It's up on the other screen over there.
It wasn't, actually. It was, when you were speaking, it was focused on you. Yeah, so if we can go to the slide with the bar graphs.
Previous one.
Yeah, and then let's show, there you go, you got happy fingers. So if you look at this slide, I think this slide is what we've been living in the auctions, and I think if you started to look, this goes back to Q4 2014 right up to Q1 2017. And just real basically, the blue graphs are the amount of allowances that were available. That's the blue. The orange is the qualified bid. So if the orange is greater than the blue, the auction was fully subscribed and it settled at either the floor price or greater. And then you'll see that there's two price points in here. You'll see that the orange dash is the floor price and the triangle is the settlement price. So what shouldn't surprise us with an efficient market is Q4 2014. We had a settlement of 1210, about 6.3% greater than the floor. Well, that settlement price ultimately was the floor for Q15. So that's an efficient market. And then as we saw, 2015, we were all feeling pretty good. But I can tell you at the end of 2015, there was a lot. It started with little rumors, probably from the attorneys saying, be careful about this court case. But all of a sudden that propagated. And it became center of discussions amongst market participants. And it started off by saying, well, what are you saying? Where'd you hear this? But then all of a sudden it became, the background noise became echoing. And I think at the end of 2015, at the end of 2016, what we saw, at the end of 2015 into 16, we saw the typical behavior of an efficient market in the fact that the settlement price was about 5% greater than the floor price. Again, typical. But then we started to see the herding. Then we started to see the market saying, I'm a market participant. Do I want to be long in this market? What are my concerns about being long allowances or long offsets, if the court case rules against ARB? So I think we started to see some behavior that said, I want to start shifting my thought here. How do I cover my obligations now, but I don't want to take on too much risks? And I think what we saw in Q4 2016 was really telling. So typically, you see that market efficiency, and what did we lose on this graph? We lost it. So look at the settlement price in Q4 2016. It was the floor price at $12.73. So inherently baked into that should have typically been that 6.2% increase from the floor price for 16 into 17, and it wasn't. So there was an opportunity. So sometimes with stale markets, there becomes opportunities. So there are opportunities to buy with a 3-month holding time and have that value of that purchase increase by 6.3% in 3 months. So markets like this, there can be winners and losers, but the fact that the orange bar wasn't greater than the blue in the fourth quarter of the year was a telltale sign that the first quarter in 2017 was going to be abysmal, and it was. And then you look at that whole, the cumulative allowances that didn't come to market. That's about 120 million tons that didn't come to market. We can talk about the mechanisms, how they come back, but that's essentially what got carved out of the market. And when I'm with our customers, we hear concerns about hypervolatility now. What happens if? We never thought that the price of carbon, we were pretty happy with the price of carbon, maybe 50 cents above the floor, but what happens if the price of carbon is double the floor? What happens in a hypervolatility event when Ontario links with us and they're naturally short by design and they start to consume our allowances? In a market like this, if these allowances don't come back efficiently to the market, what happens? So I think now that we're with our customers, that's more of a pervasive thought is, how do I hedge against this now?
It's nice to hear them say that. I mean, one of the things that the reaction to this auctions, is you see the compliance buyers are largely buying out of the auction, right? Because it's a great strategy right now. If you look at these prices, you're basically buying at the floor. So it's brilliant until it's not. And then one day when you show up and the auction goes through the roof and you're short and you're not hedged. And we can play this film back from those of you that are been around as long as I have. In the energy crisis in California, the electric utilities were buying largely in the spot market, and it was great. And everyone's talking about how great it was. The wholesale prices were coming down. It looked fantastic. And then all of a sudden the market got short for various reasons. The market became short. Prices skyrocket. 3 of the investor-owned utilities, one filed for bankruptcy, one was technically bankrupt, and the other one was hanging on. The 3 main in California at the end of that, and everyone said, "Why didn't you buy forward? Why didn't you hedge this? You're just stupid. Why wouldn't you have done that?" Well, a couple months before, they're saying how brilliant they were because they weren't, and if they had hedged, so there wasn't really a secondary market in that type developing. And the danger in this market is if the price is at the floor and people are able to get most of what they need in the auction, then the secondary markets, although they do trade a lot more than I think some people realize, the secondary markets aren't as robust as they need to be to absorb those shocks. And that's when something blows up and then people go, wow, what happened? Mm-hmm. And that can happen overnight.
So do we need more robust secondary markets? And how would that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm a markets person, but absolutely, that's the function of a market. If you think about it even from a regulatory perspective, why do we have a cap and trade market, lowest cost mechanism? But the other piece, why would you want anybody besides those that have actually just have allowance obligations and those that have the ability to create offsets in the sense that offsets even participate in that? And the answer is that these are the folks that absorb those shocks and they create liquidity so that you don't have those wild spikes.
So you'd be paying, prices would be a little bit higher if we had a more robust secondary market, right?
Well, they'd have to be. Secondary markets don't make the prices higher. They don't make them lower either. They just create, should create, if they're working properly, a stable price. What I'm saying, though, is that if the auctions are undersubscribed, then the incentive is to come in and buy just out of the auctions. And why would you buy in a secondary market unless the price was less than the auction, which it can be, mm-hmm. Certainly. There's no rule against that, but it's not a very interesting model for someone to come in and buy at the auction and sell less. Not a lot of people are going to put their capital in that game. So it becomes necessary that there's a reason to trade, and that reason to trade would be that there's potential prices that are above or below, and there's some volatility in the market.
So does that put you in the business of wanting to limit the number of offsets as well, so you get a bit more trading of the actual?
I mean, personally, speaking for myself, I've sat in panels at this very conference going back from the very beginning, advocating for offsets. I'm a believer in offsets. I think it's a great solution set. It should be one of the tools. So I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm a huge supporter of that. I'm saying is that from a policy perspective, the reality of what's happening is that the secondary market serves a role, and its role is a lot less interesting if the auctions are undersubscribed, and if it's less interesting, players will leave, and as they leave, when they're needed, they won't be there. That being said, with some of the recent activity in markets, the decisions and things like that, you're starting to see, at least from our seat, people coming in that had been on the sidelines for a while.
I'm sitting next to John. He would have been my enemy if he would have said he thought offsets should be reduced from 8%.
Yeah,
He's sitting next to a developer, so he would never say that.
I think that's what Peter was getting at, yeah.
Yeah, but I think, along, there are winners and losers, so when, we're working with spec folks, they hated what happened in the last 5 auctions, undersubscribed. But I tell you, with some of our clients, it was a great opportunity, and I think John nailed it in the fact that all of a sudden the over-the-counter market, the secondary market, became very attractive. We saw prices in the secondary market below the auction price, and it's part of our responsibility to educate our customers to say there's an opportunity here. So I think that there are winners and losers in a market like this, but absolutely, cost of compliance for many industries in the last year were lower than they expected. if they managed properly. If you go to the next slide too, that shows what Nico and John were saying with respect to the day of the auction or of the court case hearing. So if we look at these numbers, these are spots. So this is the secondary market. These are secondary market pricing. We saw about a 50-cent price increase in the spot CCA from 1362 to 1413 in one day. So that was the day that the market breathed some fresh air. Thank God, right? We got some clarification on that. And then we also saw, these are the different offset products, and we always look at, the discounts between an 8-year invalidation product, a 3-year invalidation product, or a guaranteed product versus a CCA. So we're always looking at that discount. And I think what you saw on the offset products is it lagged a little bit behind, not atypical to see that lag in the pricing on the offsets, but we saw on average a 20 to 30 cent increase in the offset products. Not the same 52-cent increase we saw in the CCAs, but give that time. It will come back. And you did see some settlement afterwards. I can say that yesterday I looked it up, and I would say that the CCA spot was 1405, so that started to come down a little bit. On the flip side, all of the offset products started to come up in price. Again, not atypical to see that kind of behavior, that reactionary behavior. So we started to see 8s at 1092, just a penny increase, but 3s started picking up. 1143 was transacted yesterday, and then Goldens were up 1263. So we're starting to see the offset prices increase. And again, the market is short offsets, because of the way California created the protocol process and the amount of eligible projects that come into the market. So naturally, the market's short. But that's some of the market behavior we saw before and after the court case ruling.
Could I just do my typical lawyer thing and rain on your parade a little bit here?
Absolutely. While you're here.
Yeah. I always feel so welcome. As I said before, I think we are, with this court decision, secure through 2020. But the real question then shifts, because for many of the purchasers here, the compliance entities, they need to plan out more than 2-3 years, right? They need to hedge much farther in advance. So the question of what occurs post-2020 is a real question, and it remains a pressing one. Matt Rodriguez spoke earlier and mentioned that their view is that they already have authority to continue cap and trade post-2020. And I understand that interpretation of the language in AB 32. I don't think it's the majority view. And I think that most people recognize that they do need express authorization for cap and trade post-2020, which is why all the bills are now on board for doing that. A lot of folks, and I heard a lot of the folks even in Sacramento, expressing a certain relief with this decision, to the extent that they were even sanguine that you don't need that 2/3 majority to defend against any future attack. This is what you were referring to earlier, Debra, with regard to a potential challenge under Prop 26, not Prop 13. SB 32 will be subject to Proposition 26. Prop 26 goes farther than Prop 13 in providing a constitutional challenge to a financial measure as constituting an illegal tax. And unlike Prop 13, the initial burden of proof is on the government to defend it as not a tax, rather than the other way around. So if a measure authorizing cap and trade post-2020 does not pass by 2/3, which is the requirement of Prop 13 for a tax, which would protect it against any challenge under Prop 13 or Prop 26. If it doesn't get a 2/3 vote, you can guarantee that the Pacific Legal Foundation will file another lawsuit January 1, 2021, challenging it as an illegal tax under Proposition 26. We'll see what the California Supreme Court will have done in the meantime. Maybe they will have established for good the rule of law in the state of California that this decision withstands Proposition 26 as well. But if not, if we don't have such a decision from the Supreme Court, and we won't have one until 2019, I don't think, and if we don't, and if that ambiguity, subtle ambiguity exists with the 2-1 decision, there will be legal challenges, and they could be upheld under Prop 26. Because, courts change in a few years' time too, just as the Supreme Court has in the last several years. So There is a real need. If you want to secure stable markets post-2020 so that folks can make sound investment decisions today, we need a 2/3 vote reauthorizing cap and trade.
Tough.
Very tough.
Talking to some EJ folks, environmental justice folks yesterday who kind of liked what they saw but wanted more. Talking to Senator Dean Flores, who's now on the Air Resources Board, who is saying this doesn't look like 2/3 vote getter yet. I'm not exactly sure where that consensus is. And I also wonder, kind of after the debacle for the oil companies last year, whether they really will be able to kind of muster a lot of political allies in this fight. You know, if the kind of 151 measures where you have some offsets, even some changes, some offsets, but kind of a guarantee of offsets will kind of continue. I don't know if you all can read the political tea leaves better than me.
What do you think of the language in 151 too about the offsets hierarchy? Because it does seem, given that offsets are the mechanism that results in the most further afield emissions reductions, it seemed like an easy target to me, but then, you know, 378 doesn't even include offset language. So just wondering how vulnerable you feel right now, like post 2020.
Vulnerable. Last year on our panel, I said I think offsets are at risk post 2020, and there was a murmur in the crowd, and there was a lot of people who approached me afterwards and said, "How could you ever think that?" And I said, "How could you ever not think that?" So I think in our business we still look at a terminal value of 2020 on offsets conservatively, and then we look at taking that product into the voluntary market, which afterwards. So I guess I'm a realist. I'm an optimist. I believe that what we're hearing, that offsets will be a viable mechanism, and I'm hopeful that they'll still be viable at 8%. Even though usage has been below 5% historically, I still think we need the 8%. So I'm an optimist, but I think my realism says, we've all been in other markets where there's too many people drinking from the Kool-Aid. And there's some real risks on this. But I know last year everybody was upset. I had even registry folks come to me and say, "How could you ever say that? Offsets are locked." But I think offsets were an amazing opportunity for ARB to be a leader in climate change. And I think what's great about the offset mechanism is it really looks at the fact that this is a global issue, and it was a first-time incentive for industries outside of California to do the right thing and to reduce carbon dioxide. I always said from an ARB perspective, that was the feather in the cap. That was the leadership that we wanted. So to take that away and say, let's just focus on California, or let's just say offsets should come from California, I think is taking a huge step back in progress.
I agree with you that it's taken a huge step back, but I think it's a risk. I think if I wouldn't claim to be able to read the tea leaves any better than anyone on the panel or anyone out there, but what I see in this is that there's very much a California-driven. This is about California, and we had leadership role. That was great. We played that role, and the political environment in the U.S. right now, and globally even, there's a lot of kind of why we should take care of California focused and all these pieces, and I think that is largely, that there'll be some kind of impact of that. It's hard to imagine that doesn't carry through some level. And I think from a market perspective and from a climate perspective, offsets are great. And as long as they're high quality, they should be a huge part of the program. I wish they were more. But the reality is I think there's going to be some push on the outside of California stuff in California.
And to John's point, I was in a meeting this morning that we're looking at a fantastic project that if I knew we had certainty beyond 2020, we'd invest in. But would we invest in it? And looking at, we have 2 years by the time the project really gets up and running to recoup our investment. So it's that uncertainty that, even Nico mentioned post 2020, that's already causing behavior, which is decreasing the amount of offsets that are going to be available to the market.
And I wonder also about California's leadership role, in creating a market that other people can link to. Like, how important is that? Do you worry that the internal debates that we're having with the legislature will make us a less attractive partner for others to link to? Glenn Murray was saying yesterday something along the lines, I don't want to misrepresent him, but he was saying something along the lines of, California's program, like California risks losing its leadership position to other countries like China or Germany or Scandinavia. And it kind of sounds also, maybe you can talk about Ontario, because the importance of Ontario, because since they do have a tighter market than we do and they have a lot more industry concentrated in a smaller area, kind of sounds like we need them more than they need us.
Well, I share that concern very much, and I think that it's very unfortunate the extent to which the range of debate in Sacramento has shifted away from greenhouse gas emission reductions. I mean, it doesn't even come up very much. I mean, the concerns are local, immediate, criteria pollutants, public health. These are real issues. Don't get me wrong; they're very important issues. But this is supposed to be about addressing climate change, and that, to quote the governor, we need more prayer and mortification. We need a greater sense of that role, and I think that actually can get some traction. Whereas defending offsets is important, and I'm a great defender of offsets. It's critically important, but I think what will appeal to a lot of folks in Sacramento and the leadership is the opportunity, let's put it bluntly, to stand up to Trump. I mean, if California is going to lead the opposition to the federal government, as most of its leaders are quick to say, as you heard Controller Yee this morning say, well, this is an opportunity to do that. And offsets provide a very tangible way to provide linkage and build coalitions beyond this state. We cannot stand up to the federal government alone. It's going to have to be a coalition. And offsets, in addition to linkage, provide that. There are folks in red states that are all in on offsets because it's an alternative to coal that isn't working for them. That's an opportunity to build consensus beyond California that can provide a foundation for the kind of leadership that California says it wants to have. So if that kind of narrative can start to gain some purchase in California, then I have some hope that this obsessive, well, that's not the wrong word, this overemphasis upon legitimate but local concerns, we can't be drowned out by the immediate. We need a little bit more of that mortification as a government.
But I think you have to keep in mind that, Deborah, I think you were saying that the folks who put in place AB 32 are largely gone. The leadership that we've got now is all gone. The leadership we've got now represents more disadvantaged communities rather than coastal wealthy folks, and they're kind of seeing. I don't know if this is too cut and dried, but if they've got to say, do we improve the health of our local communities, or do we ship the advantages out of state, which is how it's described a lot of times. They're going straight for the people at home.
But the problem is that that's a false balancing. That's a false comparison. That's not what is really going on. And we need to talk to the things that the governor talked about this morning in terms of the actual threats that are posed by climate change that are being addressed here. I mean, look, the concerns with public health are very, very real. I mean, these are compelling narratives that we hear in the testimonies of the board meetings that they have, but they're just misdirected. And this, I think they're leveraging the cap and trade reauthorization to address these very real concerns, and that's the nature of sausage making, right? I mean, that's how legislation gets done.
If you follow your thread that you said earlier about the parts of a 2/3 vote, you're going to see a lot more stuff put in this to get it across, right?
Yep.
I think that's just the reality.
Look at the transportation bill, SB1, that just recently passed. The final few votes, one Democrat voted against, so they needed a couple of Republican votes. And I've forgotten the name of the person. It was from Fresno or Modesto. We got a promise of $10 million for your local area. I mean, that's the kind of deals that get done in the last minute to get these coalitions. That's the sausage making. So there's a lot more in terms of your concerns about what's in the current version of AB 378. There's going to be a heck of a lot more put into this sausage before we ever get there.
Something to make sure we touch on, though, as I mentioned talked about the price and being undersubscribed auctions. I think, though, and a lot of people on earlier discussions talked about the prices coming down, and this is a revenue source for lots of things. The purpose of an environmental market or a cap and trade is to get the lowest cost reduction. I mean, at the end of the day, complete success would be zero price, right? Because we would have no, I mean, you follow the film for it. So we got to be clear on what we describe success, because an undersubscribed auction doesn't necessarily mean it's a failed market. Now, I believe, as I said before, secondary markets are incredibly important, and one of the things that helps the secondary market is to have some, price volatility, without a doubt. But at the end of the day, I think the policy, the reason we are doing all this is to reduce carbon at the lowest cost. And cap and trade, in my opinion, is the strength. I mean, it's the strongest mechanism to do that. You can do more, right? Theoretically, more with less. And I think that message, getting back to the environmental justice, or people that want to have command and control, I think it resonates with folks that have dug in deeper. But they still have their other things that they need to do, and rightly so. They're looking to protect their communities. But like you said, these are not necessarily different things. And I think we clearly articulating that cap and trade isn't doing poorly because the auction price wasn't $20. That would almost be the opposite. If it was at $20, it means that a lot of people are short and are trying to buy. So not the 20, I mean, whatever the number is, $50, whatever. The point being, it should come down over time.
Let me ask a question that I was asked a couple of times, if you don't mind, by folks in Sacramento. Was the undersubscription of the markets in 2016 due primarily to the legal uncertainty cast by the SCOTUS decision and the Court of Appeal decision here, or by the effectiveness of complementary measures such that the demand for allowances was lower because compliance entities had in fact reduced their emissions?
I think the first point, not the latter. I would say, the good thing about our program, and I like this program with respect to 30% obligations annually, so it creates a behavior, unlike Ontario, which kind of creates lethargism because we have until 2021 to retire. But when I looked at or speak to the market participants, it was really more of saying, I'm just concerned. I'm going to get what I need. But you know what? I got enough free allowances to meet my 30% obligation. So I don't really need to go to the market to meet that obligation. Now, if this was a true-up period and I needed to, the come to Jesus moment and true up for my 70, 70, and 100, then it would have been a different situation. But I think with the understanding that I have a 30% obligation and the concerns about the court cases created the lethargism. That's my view.
I concur, but I wouldn't say that I'm a price expert. I think there's some people that are out there that's what they do, that have come to some good analysis. But I would certainly agree that there's people that are just holding back, and there's clearly, if you even look at the list, there's entities that didn't even participate that are.
Because there are a lot of folks in Sacramento who say that that's a testimony to the effectiveness of command and control regulation, and therefore you don't need cap and trade. So I mean, this is a view that needs to be heard.
Yeah, speaking of command and control, I'm just kind of wondering, so what would have done to the supply of offsets? So, the legislature also working with EJ, passed a bill that it prevented ARB from regulating methane from dairies until 2024, right? So if they hadn't passed that, would that have increased? That would have cut the amount of offsets that you could have gotten from that, right?
Under the SLCP? Yeah, it would have. I mean, so in California, there hasn't been a lot of, we're very active in projects in California with respect to biogas to energy and some of the feed-in tariffs, et cetera. But the clients are really looking at the projects for other reasons, not for AB 32. And it creates certainty over a 10 or 15 year period with the PPAs and our clients looking for the environmental asset without being concerned about AB 32. But I think there was a window in there that allows for, SLCP is like a stick, right? It's saying you've got an opportunity to use the market mechanisms to reduce methane prior to the SLCP triggering in. But in essence, in California, there's been almost zero activity with respect to methane, ironically, right? I mean, California, with their GDP being so large in ag and so large in dairy, there's been so very little activity with respect to projects. Climeco runs 13 ag sites from an AB 32 standpoint, none of them are in California, because there's so many hurdles in California, and so many of the hurdles are what we're talking about now in some aspects, the criteria pollutants associated with the oxidation, whether or not it's through a genset or a flare of the methane. We're creating criteria pollutants then. So some of the permitting obstacles have been so difficult in California. That's the reason why we haven't seen activity. I think that we're starting to see more activity because there's been a lot of work in the regional air districts to loosen up and be more understanding or flexible with respect to permitting strategies on projects that are reducing methane. So I think that there's a lot of pressures at stake here that we're starting to see some projects being implemented, but there's been very few so far.
Is there anything else that you guys would like to see out of the legislature, or any kind of, like how much scrutiny do you really want from them, right? But there is a certain amount that's necessary. So is there a particular direction that you'd like to see these bills go? Or anything from CARB, I guess?
I think John made a good comment in the fact that in even the conversations around 2/3 vote, and the fact that we really need to be flexible and try to take into account everybody's concerns. I do like there are co-pollutant benefits associated with CO2 reductions sometimes. Not all the time. There's a lot of CO2 reductions that have nothing to do with other co-benefits of criteria pollutants. But I like the discussion, and I like maybe more of an incentive as far as if there's a way to look at physical reductions within a fence line in EJ communities. Maybe that's reducing my footprint and creating a longer position for my CCAs. But maybe there's an incentive to focus on that. Because if the marginal cost of abatement on that project are greater than the CCA price or greater than an offset price, I'm not going to do it. So it all comes down to the lowest cost. Mm-hmm. So I think that I like some incentives wrapped in to focus on the EJ issues, but not a deterrent. Not saying that offset shouldn't be allowed outside of California, but maybe there's an incentive to say let's promote behavior within the fence line, or look at an added incentive for projects like I always say our Straight Outta Compton project, because we've got a Compton project. It's a great story. But a lot of the offset folks that have projects in California are working with the EJ community. We're spending time, we're writing papers, we're volunteering to go with them and take them to the sites. So we're spending a lot of time with them because we're understanding that it's a real concern. And I think in order to get the votes that we need, we're going to have to listen to everybody around the table. So, I may get frustrated by it, but it's real. So I think there's a middle road.
So more sausage making ahead.
But the certainty has to come, or capital doesn't come. Right.
When would you say, like by the end of the year, by the end of the legislative session, or?
I mean, what was said, it should have happened a while ago.
Yeah.
And you'll see there's less capital being deployed because of indecision already.
And would you prefer to see kind of all the details, such as, what kind of caps there would be for the individual facilities in the legislation, or basically let ARB sort out the details after the bill sets the main?
Well, I personally would prefer to see that authority granted to ARB because, look, we all have our issues with ARB, but there is a greater focus upon science and upon, decision-making rooted in the science. And as this discussion itself reflects, that often is not the case in the legislature. It becomes politics, sausage-making, deals being cut. Legitimate concerns on both sides of the fence of whatever the fence is, yes, but these are hard decisions that need to be based upon scientific data. And so I personally would hope that two things. One, that the legislature increases the attention to and reliance upon data and actually parsing it. And, you can make deals between conflicting goods, between conflicting concerns. But let's do it based on data. That's hard for a legislature to do, so I would endorse giving more authority to ARB to do it because that is their approach. I mean, we all have our issues. They don't get it right all the time, but they at least, that's the orientation, and they take the time to do that.
All right. Thanks. Does anyone in the audience have any questions? If you do, just stand up and you can say them. Yeah.
So there was sort of indication that the court legal uncertainties had a sort of most important cause of what's been going on. Sort of the secondary market price jump 50 cents at the end of the decision. But we also saw in January, after the arguments were completed, a 5% jump in the secondary market. So I guess I get the point that, the floor went up pretty significantly from the fourth quarter auction, which wasn't fully subscribed, but still struggling to understand a little more what happened in the first quarter, especially considering how tight the second compliance period is. Banked allowances.
I don't know that I'm.
Yeah. Yeah, I think let's meet afterwards, and we'll take a look at those results, and let's chat after the conference, or after the session today. It's probably more appropriate. It'd be good.
Any other questions? Okay, I guess it's lunchtime.
There's one.
Yeah, sorry.
No, this was an extremely informative panel. It was good to hear that perhaps for the future it might benefit to have some, there's no representation of and it's a little bit like professionals from the political markets are here, but we're talking about other people's real experiences without them being here, and I think that might.
I think it's a good point, but I think the comment was made earlier that there's starting to be more dialogue between these groups in other settings, and I think all of us that care about these market-based mechanisms should be embracing that and working towards that. And I think it'd be great to see the folks that have a different set of concerns coming in and saying, because this successful program in many ways could obviously be more successful to achieve multiple goals.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Collaboration is absolutely everything, right? I know this week, AIDA, I wasn't there, but I know several folks here, Nico was, in Sacramento, working with legislators and, just educating. It's all part of the process. And I think all of us as market participants are carving out money to educate, carving out time and money of our teams to meet with the EJ community. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways because we believe in the markets. We want them to be strong and supportive. But I think the onus is on us to work together and to bring them to the table.
And how can you get clients who are actually part of that community so that they can realize the financial benefits as well as the health benefits? And if people start making money doing it and their communities are getting better, that will create a shift.
When you say get clients in the community, are you referring to within the EJ communities, or?
Yeah.
Okay, right.
People have businesses.
Absolutely.
Not all, frankly, men.
Right.
Thanks for saying that. That's appreciated.
I can't change that part.
Nor can I.
I'm glad for myself.
I would like to make two comments in that regard. The first is when we met in Sacramento, we weren't just educating and informing and spilling our narratives. We sought out in that delegation, we primarily focused upon trying to speak with those members of the Assembly and others that were representatives of and voices for the EJ communities, and listening to them as much as offering a resource, but also listening to the concerns and trying to identify where there is common ground and where there's not common ground, but we can find a way to come to some kinds of agreements. And the second point I would make is that I do have clients in these communities. I represent a number of Native Americans that have forest projects, and you want to know of some EJ communities. They're not in California, but we should speak more broadly about what we mean by EJ communities. I would argue that it ought to extend beyond the state's boundaries, and these are communities that, believe me, they're faced with strip mining or cutting down their forest and changing their ancient ways of sustaining themselves, or being able to preserve that forest and benefit and make a contribution to the larger environment as well as sustain themselves. So these are views and values that are shared beyond the those that speak loudest on these issues. So it's a matter of listening, but also of widening the discussion, I would say.
Yeah, I just don't want to get to the point where we're looking at the map of the United States and every EJ community and saying we can only do greenhouse gas reduction projects there. That's the wrong approach. But I like what Nico just said as far as looking at EJ communities outside of California and the importance of that, because there are a lot of projects outside of California that are located in EJ communities. And are we even talking about that story? That's a great message. But we love our Compton project because it's in the heart. And it's our biggest refrigerant recycling facility, and we employ people. People are there. There's benefits. People are getting paid a good wage to do that, and that's a positive story. But I think all of us are trying to reach out and find those positive stories to help communicate this.
All right, great. Well, if no one has any more questions, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you. Hope everyone understands more about where everyone's coming from. Thank you. Thank you very much, guys.